My name is Paul Morrison, and this story happened to me when I was 17 years old, in the summer of 1987. We were a normal family, or at least I thought we were, until that trip to Shawnee National Forest. I can't forget what happened. I don't think I ever will. It all started when my dad, Frank, a wildlife biologist, decided to take us on one of his research trips. He wanted to study wolf populations in the forest, and my mom, Linda, who was an anthropologist, thought it would be a great opportunity to learn more about Native American folklore. Me? I wasn't thrilled about spending weeks in the middle of nowhere, but I brought my camera with me. Photography was my thing, and I thought documenting the trip would make it slightly less boring. We pulled up in our old 1985 Winnebago Chieftain. It was our home for the next 3 weeks, a boxy, beige RV that smelled like old wood and coffee. The forest was huge, dark, and quiet in all the wrong ways. The trees were so tall and dense that they blocked most of the sunlight, making the whole place feel heavy, like a weight pressing down on you. Dad was immediately excited. He had his notebooks, binoculars, and tracking gear out within minutes of parking. Mom was unpacking, already scribbling something in her journal. I grabbed my camera and stepped outside for some fresh air. That's when I saw them, the tracks. Huge tracks. I crouched down and took a closer look. They looked like wolf paw prints, but something about them wasn't right. They were too big. Way too big. I placed my hand next to one to compare, and it was almost the size of my palm. And here's the weird part. They didn't look like they belonged to a four-legged animal. They were staggered, like something had been walking upright. It creeped me out, but I snapped a few pictures anyway and called my dad over. "Hey, Dad, look at these," I shouted. He came over, adjusted his glasses, and studied the tracks. After a moment, he shrugged. "Maybe just a big wolf," he said. "Could even be two wolves walking together, overlapping tracks. Don't worry about it." Typical dad, always rational, never letting his imagination wander too far. I wanted to believe him, but something about the tracks didn't sit right with me. That night, we sat around the tiny RV dining table, eating canned chili and crackers. The forest was eerily quiet, too quiet. You'd think we'd hear birds or crickets or something, but there was nothing. Just silence. As we were cleaning up, there was a knock on the RV door. It startled all of us because, honestly, who on earth would be out here? Dad opened the door, and standing there was an old woman. She looked like she had stepped straight out of one of the folk tales Mom loved so much. Her long gray hair was tied back in a braid, and she wore a shawl covered in intricate patterns. She introduced herself as Catherine Running Bear, but she said I could call her Two Hearts. She didn't waste time with small talk. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice firm and serious, like a warning. "What do you mean?" Dad asked, always the skeptic. "This land is sacred, but it's also dangerous," she said. "The spirits here, they don't take kindly to strangers, and there are things in these woods you don't want to meet. Leave before it's too late." Mom, of course, was fascinated. "Are you talking about the moonwalkers?" she asked, her eyes lighting up. I'd heard her mention that term before, some legend about humans cursed to take the form of wolves. Catherine nodded, but didn't say much more. She just looked at me for a long moment, her dark eyes narrowing as if she knew something about me that I didn't. Then she turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing as quickly as she'd arrived. That night I couldn't sleep. Neither could my parents. We all lay in our bunks, listening to the forest outside, the silence now replaced by the sound of howling wolves. But these howls weren't normal. They didn't come from one direction, they echoed from all around us, closing in like a pack surrounding prey. I pressed my hands over my ears and shut my eyes, but the howls wouldn't stop. It felt like they were inside my head, pulling at something deep inside of me. I told myself it was just wolves doing what wolves do, but something in my gut told me everything Catherine said was right. We shouldn't have been there. And that was just the first night. The next morning, I woke up feeling heavy, like I hadn't really slept at all. I could still hear the howls from the night before ringing in my ears, even though the forest outside was quiet again. Dad was already up, drinking coffee and scribbling notes at the small RV table. Mom was nearby, flipping through one of her books on Native American folklore. I grabbed my camera and stepped outside. The air was cold for a summer morning, and the forest felt strange, like it wasn't quite awake yet. As I walked around, I kept thinking about Catherine and what she'd said. I wanted to believe it was all just folklore, like one of Mom's stories that she loved so much, but something about her eyes stuck with me. She didn't look scared when she warned us. She looked serious, and that scared me more than anything. As I wandered further from the RV, I stumbled onto the tracks again. The same ones from yesterday, but this time there were more. A lot more. They weaved in and out of the campsite in a wide circle, almost like whoever or whatever they belonged to had been watching us in the night. I crouched down, following the trail until it led me to the edge of the trees. That's when I saw it. In the dirt, half buried under some leaves, was one of Dad's motion sensor cameras, or at least what was left of it. The lens was smashed, the plastic cracked, and the wires hung loose like something had ripped it apart. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, trying to figure out what could have done it. A bear, maybe? But bears didn't leave tracks like the ones I'd seen. I was about to call out to Dad when I heard something. A branch snapped. I froze and slowly turned toward the sound. The forest ahead of me was a wall of trees, dark shadows stretching between them. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a flicker of gray darting between the trunks. It was quick, almost too quick to notice, but I swear it was there. My heart started pounding, and I stepped back, clutching the broken camera. "Paul, breakfast!" Mom's voice called out from the RV, breaking through the silence and startling me. I spun around and ran back toward camp, the feeling of being watched creeping up my spine the whole way. Inside the RV, I handed the broken camera to Dad and told him what I'd seen. He frowned and inspected it, muttering something about raccoons or coyotes. Typical Dad, always looking for the logical explanation. Mom, on the other hand, was more concerned about the tracks. "Paul," she said, her voice calm but serious, "did you see anything out there? Anything strange?" I shook my head, not wanting to admit what I thought I'd seen. "Just more tracks," I said instead. That's when Dad looked up from his notes. "You know," he said, "these tracks are odd. Too big for a wolf, too narrow for a bear. They don't make sense." Mom glanced at him, and I could see the worry in her eyes. "What if Catherine was right?" she asked quietly. "What if there's something out there that isn't natural?" Dad sighed and rubbed his temples. "Linda, please, let's not scare the boy with campfire stories. I'm sure there's an explanation." "Then explain this." Mom shot back, holding up one of her books. She flipped it open to a page with a drawing of a wolf walking upright on its hind legs. The caption underneath read, "Skin Changers of the Woodland Tribes." Dad waved her off, but I could tell her words got to him. And honestly, they got to me too. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew something strange was happening. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the trees, Catherine returned. She didn't knock this time, she just appeared in the clearing like she'd been standing there the whole time. Dad looked annoyed, but Mom welcomed her in, eager to hear more of her stories. "I told you to leave," Catherine said, her voice low and serious. "You're still here." "We're not going anywhere," Dad replied firmly. "We're here to study wolves, that's all." "There are no wolves here," Catherine said, her gaze locking on Dad. "Not like the ones you know." Mom leaned in. "What do you mean by not like the ones you know?" she asked. Catherine sighed, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the entire forest was pressing down on her. "There are spirits in these woods," she said. "Old, restless spirits. Some take the form of wolves. Others take different forms. They walk between two worlds, human and animal. We call them moonwalkers. They are neither fully alive nor fully dead." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know what to say, so I stayed quiet, watching her closely. She turned to me then, her sharp eyes narrowing as if she could see straight through me. "You feel it, don't you?" she said, her voice softer now. "The pull of the forest." I blinked, confused. I don't know what you're talking about, I muttered, trying to sound braver than I felt. She smiled sadly. You will. Before anyone could say anything else, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees like a ghost. Dad shook his head and muttered something about superstitions. But Mom looked worried. Paul, she said, kneeling in front of me, if you ever see anything out there, anything strange, you come straight back, okay? I nodded, but inside, I was already questioning everything. Who or what was Catherine warning us about? And why did I feel like her words were meant for me? That night, the howls returned. Louder this time. Closer. The next few days passed in a strange, uneasy blur. Dad went out early every morning with his notebook and binoculars, searching for signs of wolves. Mom spent hours buried in her books, comparing Catherine's warnings to the pictographs and legends she was uncovering. And me? I stuck close to the RV whenever I could. I didn't want to admit it, but the forest gave me the creeps. It felt alive, like it was watching us. But then Dad convinced me to join him for a hike one morning. You've got your camera, right? He said, smiling like this was just a normal family outing. Come on, Paul. I'll show you where the real adventure is. I didn't want to go, but I didn't want to argue either. So I grabbed my camera, slung it around my neck, and followed him into the woods. We walked for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper into the forest. The trees seemed taller here, their branches weaving together to block out most of the sunlight. The farther we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional snap of a twig. Don't you think it's weird? I asked at one point, my voice sounding small in the heavy silence. How quiet it is out here. Dad glanced back at me and shrugged. Predators can do that, he said. If there's something big in the area like a wolf pack, the smaller animals stay away. It's just nature. I didn't say anything, but his answer didn't make me feel any better. Something about this silence wasn't natural. It was too complete, too oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. Then we found it. We stepped into a small clearing, and the ground was wrong. It was covered in bones. Some were old and weathered, others fresher and still stained red. They weren't scattered like an animal's kill site, though they were arranged in a circle, almost like a ritual. In the center of the circle was a large wolf skull, its empty eye socket staring up at us. Around it, strange symbols were carved into the dirt. I stared at the scene, my stomach turning. What is this? I whispered. Dad crouched down, examining the symbols. I don't know, he muttered. This isn't natural. He picked up the wolf skull, turning it over in his hands. Then he froze, his face going pale. Get your camera, he said quickly. Take pictures of this. All of it. I fumbled with my camera, my hands shaking as I snapped photos of the circle, the bones, the symbols. Every click of the shutter felt like a shout in the silent forest. I wanted to leave everything in me was screaming to get out of. There, but Dad was too focused, too fascinated. Let's go back now, I pleaded after a while. Please, Dad, I don't like this. He hesitated, glancing around the clearing one last time. Then he nodded. Okay, he said softly, we'll head back. As we turned to leave, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, just a flicker of something gray slipping between the trees. I didn't say anything, but my steps quickened, and I stayed close to Dad all the way back to the RV. That night, I developed the photos I'd taken. The camera I used wasn't digitalis, was 1987, so I had to use film, which meant setting up a mini darkroom in the RV. I worked quietly, watching the images take shape in the red light. At first, they looked normal, just pictures of the strange circle in the clearing. But then, in one photo, I saw them. Eyes. Glowing yellow eyes in the darkness beyond the clearing. They were faint but unmistakable, peering out from the shadows like they were watching us. My chest tightened, and I quickly flipped to the next photo. More eyes. And the next. And the next. They were in almost every shot, surrounding us, hidden in the trees. I felt sick. Paul? Mom's voice startled me, and I jumped, nearly dropping one of the photos. She stepped into the small room, holding one of her books. "You okay?" "Yeah," I stammered, quickly shoving the pictures under a stack of paper. "I'm fine." She frowned, studying me for a moment, but didn't push. Instead, she handed me the book. "I found something," she said, her voice low. "I'm not sure what it means yet, but it feels connected to what Catherine said." I flipped the book open to the page she'd marked. It showed a series of pictograph-screwed drawings of humans transforming into wolves under a full moon. Around the edges were symbols similar to the ones we'd seen in the clearing. The caption beneath the drawings read, "****, The Curse of the Skin Changers. ****. Skin Changers," I mumbled, my throat dry. Is that what this is?" Mom hesitated, then nodded. "It's possible," she said softly. "The legends say these were people who could take on the form of wolves, but it wasn't by choice. It was a curse, passed down through bloodlines. Once it starts, it can't be stopped." Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and impossible to ignore. I wanted to ask more, to understand what she was saying, but before I could, a loud thud echoed outside. "What was that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Mom grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the front of the RV, where Dad was already at the door, flashlight in hand. "Stay here," he said firmly, stepping outside. Mom and I watched from the window as Dad scanned the area with the flashlight. The beam lit up the trees, the grass, the edges of the campsite. Everything looked normal until it didn't. The light caught something shiny in the distance, and Dad slowly moved closer. "Frank, don't!" Mom hissed through the door, but he didn't listen. A few seconds later, he stopped and bent down to pick something up. When he came back, he was holding a piece of broken metal. It was part of his research equipment. The motion sensor camera. "It's smashed," he said, stepping back inside. "Completely destroyed." "By what?" Mom asked, her voice tight. Dad didn't answer. He just set the broken camera on the table and sat down, his face pale. None of us slept that night. The howls started again just after midnight, louder and closer than ever before. And this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just random cries in the night. They were warning us, or calling to us. I couldn't tell which was worse. By the time the sun rose the next day, none of us had gotten any real sleep. The howling had gone on for hours, sometimes so close it felt like the wolves were right outside the RV. I kept expecting something to slam against the walls or claw at the windows, but nothing ever did. It was like they were toying with us, letting us know they were out there waiting. Dad tried to act like everything was fine. He spent the morning tinkering with his broken tracking equipment, muttering under his breath. Mom, on the other hand, was quiet, too quiet. She kept looking out the window, her brow furrowed, like she was expecting to see something in the trees. And me? I didn't even want to step outside. Every time I looked at the forest, I felt it pulling at me, like it wanted me to come closer. Around noon, Dad decided we needed to head back to the spot where we'd found the ritual circle. "We need more data," he said, packing his gear into a backpack. "Whatever's going on out here, we can't just ignore it." Mom didn't look happy about the idea, but she agreed to go, probably because she thought she could help. I didn't have much of a choice. Dad insisted I come along, saying it was good experience for me. So the three of us set out into the woods again, following the same trail as before. The forest felt different this time. Darker, colder. The trees seemed to close in around us, blocking out the sunlight, even though it was the middle of the day. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling. A low growl, but every time I stopped to listen, it was gone. When we reached the clearing, the circle was still there, just as we'd left it. The bones, the symbols, the wolf's skullet was all untouched. But there was something new. Around the edges of the clearing, deep in the dirt, were more tracks, huge ones. They circled the site, overlapping and crisscrossing like a dozen creatures had been pacing there. Dad crouched down, examining the tracks. "These are fresh," he said, sounding more excited than scared. "Whatever made these was here recently, maybe even last night." "Frank, we shouldn't be here," Mom said, her voice tight. "This place, it isn't safe." "We'll be fine," Dad replied, brushing her off like he always did. "Just help me document this, will you?" Mom sighed but pulled out her notebook, jotting down notes while Dad paced around, taking measurements. I stayed on the edge of the clearing, clutching my camera and trying not to look too closely at the bones. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than ever. I couldn't shake the idea that something was hiding in the trees, just out of sight. I was about to tell Dad we should leave when I noticed something strange. On one of the trees near the clearing, there were scratches long, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by claws. I pointed them out to Dad, and he frowned, running his fingers over the grooves. "These aren't from any wolf I've ever seen," he muttered. "Too high up, too deep. It almost looks deliberate." "Frank," Mom said sharply, her voice trembling. "Look." She was pointing at the ground just a few feet away. One of the bones in the circular rib maybe was moving. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but there was no breeze. It was shaking, vibrating like something beneath the dirt was trying to pull it under. "Okay, that's enough," Mom said, grabbing Dad's arm. "We're leaving, now." Dad opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, a low growl echoed through the clearing. It wasn't a wolf's growl, it was deeper, rougher, almost like it had words buried in it. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my legs start to shake. "Go," Mom whispered, shoving me toward the trail. "Go, go, go." We ran all the way back to the RV, not stopping until we were inside with the door locked. Dad tried to calm us down, saying it was probably just an animal, but he didn't sound convinced. His hands were shaking as he poured himself a cup of coffee, spilling some on the table. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the growl wasn't the only thing that was bothering me. As we'd run back, I'd felt something changing. It was hard to explain, but it was like the forest had gotten under my skin. My senses felt sharper every sound. Every smell seemed turned up like someone had flipped a switch. And my skin felt hot, like I was running a fever. "Mom?" I said quietly, sitting down at the table. "I don't feel so good." She looked up from her notes, concern flashing across her face. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," I admitted. I feel weird. Like something's wrong with me." She pressed a hand to my forehead and frowned. "You're burning up," she said. "Frank, we need to do something. He's sick." Dad looked over, his face pale. "It's probably just stress," he said weakly. "Or maybe a bug bite. He'll be fine." But I wasn't fine. The fever got worse as the day went on, and by the time the sun started to set, my whole body felt like it was on fire. I could barely keep my eyes open, and when I did, everything looked different. The colors seemed brighter, sharper, like I was seeing the world through someone else's eyes. And the smell God, the smells. I could smell the dirt, the trees, even the chilly Mom was heating up for dinner, and it all felt overwhelming, like my brain couldn't process it fast enough. That night, as I lay in my bunk, sweating and shaking, I heard the howls again, but this time, they didn't feel random. They felt directed, like they were meant for me. And as much as I wanted to block them out, part of me, some deep, desperate part, wanted to answer. I didn't understand it then, but Catherine was right. The forest was pulling me in, and no matter how hard I tried to fight it, I was starting to lose. When I woke up the next morning, the fever was gone. My body felt normal, better than normal, actually. I felt sharp, clear, like I'd slept for a week, but it wasn't a relief. It was unsettling. My hands were steady. My head wasn't pounding anymore. But deep down, something felt different. It's hard to explain. It was like I wasn't entirely myself. I climbed out of my bunk and found Mom and Dad sitting at the RV table. They were speaking in hushed voices, and when they saw me, they both stopped abruptly. Mom's eyes scanned me like she was trying to see if anything about me had changed. Dad gave me a forced smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "How are you feeling, kiddo?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Better," I said, sitting down. "I think the fever's gone." Mom leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "Paul, did anything strange happen last night? Or the night before?" I hesitated. I didn't want to tell them about the howls, about the feeling that they were calling me, about the strange dreams I'd been having, dreams of running through the forest, my heart pounding, the earth soft beneath my feet, dreams that felt too real, too vivid. "No," I lied, "just the fever." Mom and Dad exchanged a look. One of those silent conversations adults seem to have with their eyes. I didn't like it. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Mom exhaled deeply, like she'd been holding her breath. "Paul," she started carefully, "there's something we need to talk to you about. Something about our family." "Our family?" I asked, confused. She nodded, glancing at Dad for support. He looked down at his hands, avoiding my eyes. Mom continued. "You remember the stories Catherine told us? About the moonwalkers?" "Yeah," I said slowly, dreading where this was going. "Well," she said, her voice dropping, "there's a chance those stories could be connected to us." "What?" I breathed, my stomach twisting. She reached for one of her books, flipping it open to a page filled with symbols and drawings. "These legends about people cursed to transform into wolves under the full moon, they aren't just stories. They're part of this region's history. And, Paul, they're part of our history." I stared at her, trying to process her words. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "What does that have to do with me?" Mom's hands trembled as she turned the book toward me. "Your great-grandmother," she said, "she was accused of being a skin changer, a moonwalker. It's why her family left this area generations ago. They were trying to outrun the curse." "That's ridiculous," I said, shaking my head. "Dad, tell her this is ridiculous." But Dad didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at the table. "You don't actually believe this, do you?" I pressed, my voice rising. "It's just a stupid story." "Then how do you explain the fever?" Mom asked, her voice steady. "The tracks? The things you've been hearing at night? Paul, we've all seen the strange things happening here. This isn't just in your head." I couldn't handle it. I stood up, knocking my chair over. "This is insane!" I shouted. "I'm not some cursed wolf person. I'm just me." "Paul, calm down," Dad said finally, his voice firm but gentle. "We're not saying this to scare you. We're trying to help." "Help with what?" I demanded. "There's nothing wrong with me." I stormed out of the RV, slamming the door behind me. The forest was waiting, still and quiet, like it had been expecting me. I didn't know where I was going, but I just needed to get away. Away from Mom's crazy stories. Away from Dad's guilty silence. Away from the growing fear that maybe, just maybe, they were right. I didn't realize how far I'd walked until I reached a small stream, the water bubbling softly over smooth stones. I crouched down and splashed some on my face, trying to clear my head. But the moment the water touched my skin, a strange sensation washed over me. It wasn't cold, it was warm, too warm, and it sent a tingling feeling through my entire body, like my nerves were on fire. I stumbled back, breathing hard. "What's happening to me?" I whispered, clutching my arms. My heart was racing, and for a moment the forest around me looked different, brighter, sharper. I could see every leaf, every blade of grass, in crystal clear detail. I could hear the stream, the wind in the branches, even the faint rustle of animals in the underbrush. It was overwhelming. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. I spun around, my eyes scanning the trees. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Something tall and gray, moving between the shadows. It wasn't a wolf. It stood on two legs, its long arms ending in clawed hands. Its eyes glowed faintly, like the ones I'd seen in my photos. It was watching me. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could hear me. The creature tilted its head, almost like it was studying me. And then it stepped forward, into the light. My breath caught in my throat. Its face was a horrifying mix of human and wolf, with sharp teeth bared and a snarl and matted fur covering its body. It let out a low, rumbling growl, and I knew, without a doubt, that this thing was real. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. The forest seemed to close in around me as I sprinted back toward the RV. The creature's growls echoed behind me, growing louder, closer. My legs burned, my chest heaved, but I didn't dare slow down. I could feel it chasing me, its presence a heavy weight pressing down on me. When the RV finally came into view, I screamed for my parents. "Mom, Dad, open the door!" The door flew open, and Dad pulled me inside just as something slammed into the side of the RV. The entire vehicle shook, and a deep, guttural snarl filled the air. Mom grabbed a kitchen knife, while Dad braced himself against the door, his face pale. "What was that?" Mom asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I managed to gasp, "but it's out there." The creature let out one last howl-a-long, mournful sound that sent shivers down my spine. And then, just like that, it was gone. But I wasn't relieved, because the next full moon was only days away. The hours after the creature attacked the RV felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. None of it felt real, but at the same time, it felt too real. Dad checked the outside of the RV once he was sure the thing was gone. There were scratches deep in the metal, long claw marks running across the side. One of the windows was cracked, and the campsite was destroyed, things thrown around like a storm had swept through. I stayed inside, sitting at the table, staring at my hands. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. Was I turning into one of those things? My skin felt strange, my senses too sharp and alive. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, that it was all in my head, but a part of me deep down knew that something inside me was changing. Mom sat down across from me, her face pale but calm. "We're going to figure this out, Paul," she said quietly. "You're not alone in this." "How are you so calm about this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "This isn't normal. None of this is normal." "I know," she said, "but freaking out isn't going to help." She reached across the table and took my hand. "We'll get through this, together." Dad came back in, shaking his head. "Whatever that thing was, it's gone for now," he said, "but we need to be ready in case it comes back." "And what about Paul?" Mom asked, her voice sharp. "We can't just sit around waiting for the full moon to see what happens." Dad rubbed his face, looking tired, older than usual. "We don't even know if. If it's going to happen," he said. "We have no proof, Linda." Mom shot him a look. "Don't we?" she said, holding up the book with the Skin Changer legends. "The fever, the tracks, everything Catherine said, it all lines up." "What does that mean?" I asked, my throat dry. "What's going to happen to me?" For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Mom sighed. "If the legends are true," she said, "then the full moon could trigger the change." "The change?" I repeated, my stomach twisting. Into one of those things?" She nodded, her eyes soft with worry. "But we're not going to let it happen," she said quickly. "There has to be a way to stop it, a way to break the curse." The next few days passed in a blur. Mom spent every waking moment studying the books, looking for anything that could help us. Dad focused on keeping the RV secure, rigging up locks and reinforcing the windows. As for me, I felt like I was on the edge of a cliff, waiting to fall. My senses kept getting stronger, sounds too loud, smells too strong. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves outside, the creak of the RV as it settled, even my parents' whispers in the next room. It was overwhelming, and I hated it. The worst part was the forest. It felt like it was calling to me, pulling at me every time I looked out the window. I didn't understand it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees, the shadows, the howls, they all wanted me to come closer. I started to stay away from the windows altogether, afraid of what I might see, or worse, what I might do. Then the night of the full moon arrived. It started slowly. At first, it felt like the fever was coming back, a deep burning heat spreading through my body. I thought maybe I could fight it, that if I stayed calm, it would go away. But it didn't. The heat grew stronger, and then the pain started. It was like my bones were shifting under my skin, stretching and twisting in ways they weren't supposed to. I cried out, clutching my arms, my legs, my chest, but the pain wouldn't stop. "Paul?" Mom yelled, rushing to my side. "It's okay. It's okay. We're here." "It's not okay," I shouted, my voice breaking. It hurts so much." Dad grabbed Mom's arm, pulling her back. "We can't stop this," he said, his voice grim. "We have to let it happen." "No," Mom snapped, trying to pull away. "There has to be something we can do." But it was too late. I could feel the change taking over. My skin prickling as fur began to sprout along my arms, my hands twisting into claws. My jaw ached as it stretched, my teeth growing longer and sharper. My senses exploded, every sound, every smell hitting me all at once. I could hear my mom crying, my dad breathing heavily. The scrape of boots outside the RV was too much, and I couldn't control it. I felt myself slipping away, the world around me blurring as something primal took over. The pain faded, replaced by a hunger so deep it felt like it would swallow me whole. I stumbled toward the door, but Dad blocked my path. "Paul, stop," he said, his voice firm. "You don't have to do this. Fight it." I growled in actual Groland for a moment. I didn't recognize myself. I was no longer Paul. I was something else. "Frank, do something," Mom pleaded, gripping his arm. "I don't know what to do," he snapped back. Then, outside, the howls began. They were louder than ever, surrounding the RV like a wave of sound. And this time, I understood them. They weren't random, they were calling me. They were my pack, and they wanted me to join them. "No," I whispered, clutching my head. "I'm not like them. I'm not like them. Paul, look at me." Mom grabbed my face, forcing me to meet her eyes. "You are not a monster. Do you hear me? This isn't who you are." For a moment, her words cut through the haze, and I felt a flicker of control. But then something slammed into the RV, the force so strong it nearly knocked us off our feet. The sounds of claws scraping against metal filled the air, and the growls outside grew louder, angrier. "They're here," Dad said, his voice shaking. "They're coming for him." Mom pulled me close, her arms wrapped tight around me. "We're not giving him up," she said fiercely. "Do you hear me, Frank? We're not giving up on our son." The RV shook again, and I could feel the pack outside, clawing, snarling, trying to get in. And deep down, some part of me wanted to let them in. Some part of me wanted to let go. The RV shook again, harder this time, and I stumbled, barely catching myself on the edge of the table. The snarls outside were deafening now, like a chorus of anger and hunger surrounding us. Claws scraped against the sides of the vehicle, the screech of metal making my heart pound like it was going to explode. Mom held onto my arm, her grip tight, her voice calm but tremulous. "Paul, stay with us," she said. "Whatever you're feeling, fight it. You're still you." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that I could win this, but the heat inside me was rising again. My limbs ached, my vision blurred, and my body felt like it was being pulled in two different directions. Part of me wanted to stay with my parents, safe in the RV, but the other part, the part that felt wild, untamed, was begging me to go outside, to answer the call of the pack. I can't," I choked out, my voice coming out deeper, guttural. "They're in my head. I can feel them." "It's not real," Dad said, his voice firm. He stood by the door, holding a fire poker like it was a sword. It's just the curse messing with your mind. The RV shuddered again, and this time the window cracked, a jagged line splitting the glass. A howl pierced the night, so loud and close it felt like it was coming from inside my own chest. My head snapped toward the sound unintentionally. Instinctive lion, I knew they were waiting for me, and they were getting impatient. "They won't stop until they get him," Dad said, glancing nervously at Mom. "We need to do something." Mom shook her head. "We're not giving him to them." Her voice was steady, but I could see the fear in her eyes. "Frank, there has to be another way." "The only way to stop this is to fight them," Dad said, gripping the fire poker so tightly his knuckles turned white. "If we let them take him, he'll be gone. He'll be one of them forever." "I can hear you, you know," I snapped, my voice sharp and strained. I clenched my fists, trying to steady myself, trying to hold on to my humanity. "I'm not going anywhere with them." But even as I said it, I felt the pull getting stronger. The howls were like a song I couldn't ignore, tugging at the edges of my mind, whispering promises I didn't understand but couldn't resist. Another crash rocked the RV, and this time the door bent inward, the hinges groaning under the force. Whatever was outside didn't just want mate, needed me, and it was done waiting. Without warning, Dad threw the door open. The cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine, dirt, and something wild and musky. It hit me like a wave, and I stumbled back, my senses lighting up like a firework. "Frank, what are you doing?" Mom yelled. "Giving us a chance," Dad said, stepping outside, the fire poker raised. "Stay inside. Lock the door behind me." "No!" I shouted, panic flaring in my chest. "Dad, don't!" But he didn't stop. He slammed the door shut behind him, and for a moment, everything went quiet. The howls, the growls, the scratch-a-saw of it stopped, like the forest was holding its breath. Then came the roar. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something in between, a horrible guttural noise that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I pressed my face to the window, my breath fogging the glass, and saw them. The pack. There were at least 6 of them, their massive, hulking forms outlined by the pale light of the full moon. Their fur gleamed silver and gray, their eyes glowing like embers. They moved with a strange, fluid grace, circling Dad like wolves cornering prey. And at the center of them stood the largest Onia creature that towered over the rest, its shoulders broad, its claws long, its teeth bared in a wicked snarl. Officer Tanner. Or at least, what used to be him. I could see it in his eyes, even through the monstrous features. He wasn't just another member of the pack, he was their leader, their alpha. Dad raised the fire poker, brandishing it like a weapon, and for a moment, it looked like the pack hesitated. Tanner tilted his head, studying him, and then he growled a low, rumbling sound that made my chest tighten. The other creatures howled in response, and in the blink of an eye, they charged. "Dad!" I screamed, slamming my fists against the window. "Get back inside!" But he didn't run. He swung the poker wildly, keeping the creatures at bay, his movements quick but desperate. Tanner hung back, watching, waiting, his eyes flicking toward the RV, toward me. "They're going to kill him," Mom cried, her hands gripping my shoulders. "Paul, we have to do something." I started, my voice catching. "I don't know what to do." But the answer was already there, buried deep inside me, clawing to get out. I could hear it in the howls, feel it in the pounding of my heart. The pack wasn't here to kill me. They were here to take me, to make me one of them. And if I stepped outside, if I let go of the fear, the doubt, the part of me that was human, I could stop them. But I would never be the same again. "Paul," Mom said, her voice trembling, "whatever you're thinking, don't do it. Please." I turned to her, tears in my eyes, and said, "If I don't, Dad's going to die." Before she could stop me, I threw open the door and stepped into the night. The world outside was different. Brighter, sharper. Every sound, every smell was magnified, and it hit me all at once. The pack turned toward me, their glowing eyes locking onto mine, and I felt the pull again stronger this time, almost unbearable. Tanner took a step forward, his massive form blocking out the moonlight. He tilted his head, his lips curling into a wicked smile, and I knew what he was thinking. I wasn't just a threat. I was an opportunity, a new recruit, a new member of his twisted family. But I wasn't going to let him win. I closed my eyes, focusing on the fire burning inside me, the heat that had been building for days. I felt my body shift, my skin prickling as fur sprouted along my arms, my teeth lengthening into fangs. The pain was almost unbearable, but I didn't fight it this time. I let it happen. I let myself change. When I opened my eyes, the pack was staring at me, their growls dying down into low rumbles. Tanner's smile faded, replaced by something else. Fear. I didn't wait. With a snarl, I lunged. The moment my feet hit the ground, it was like the forest came alive. My senses exploded in every direction. I could smell the cold dampness of the earth beneath my feet, the wild musk of the pack, and even the faint hint of blood in the air. Every sound was razor-sharp, the rustle of leaves in the wind, my dad's frantic breathing behind me, and the low guttural growl coming from Tanner's chest. But what scared me most wasn't the pack in front of me. It was what I felt inside. The fire. The pull. It wasn't just the forest calling me anymore, it was something deeper, something alive in my chest. This wasn't just a curse, it was a hunger, a need, and it terrified me. Tanner took a step closer, his glowing amber eyes locked onto mine. The other creatures stayed back, their movements hesitant, as if they were waiting to see what I'd do. Tanner tilted his head, studying me, and for a split second, the corners of his mouth twitched up in what I could only describe as approval. He thinks I'm one of them. Asterisk, I realized. He thinks I'll join them. Asterisk. But then Dad shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Paul, don't you let them take you. You're stronger than this. Stronger? I wasn't sure about that. I didn't feel strong. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff, one misstep away from falling. But when I looked at Dad standing there with nothing but a fire poker to protect himself, I knew I had to try. I couldn't let Tanner or the pack take me, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let them hurt my family. With a deep breath, I faced Tanner. I'm not joining you, I said, my voice low, steady growling. Almost. Tanner let out a low chuckle, a chilling sound that sent a shiver down my spine. He didn't respond with words. Instead, he lunged. It happened so fast, I barely had time to react. 1 second, he was standing in front of me. The next, he was on me, his claws swiping at my chest. Instinct took over, and I moved not like a human would, but like something else, something faster, stronger. I dodged his attack, landing on all fours, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of myself in the RV's cracked window. My reflection wasn't mine. It was something half human, half wolf, my face twisted into a snarl, my eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. But there wasn't time to think about that. Tanner came at me again, his claws aimed for my throat. This time, I met him head on. Our bodies collided with a force that sent us both crashing to the ground. He snarled, snapping his jaws at me, but I pushed back, driving him away with a strength I didn't know I had. The rest of the pack watched from the shadows, their eyes glowing in the darkness. They didn't interfere, this wasn't their fight. This was a challenge. Me against Tanner, one-on-one, to see who would come out on top. I didn't know much about pack dynamics, but I understood this. If I lost, it was over. I could feel the hunger growing stronger with each passing second, the wild part of me begging to take control. It whispered to me, telling me to let go, to embrace the power, to tear Tanner apart. But I couldn't. If I gave in, even for a moment, I knew I'd lose myself. I'd become just like them. Tanner lunged again, his claws raking across my arm. Pain shot through me, sharp and hot, but I didn't back down. I shoved him away, growling low in my throat, and for the first time, I saw hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't expecting me to fight this hard. Behind me, I heard Mom's voice. "Paul, you can do this. Don't let them take you." Her words were like an anchor, pulling me back from the edge. I focused on her voice, on the sound of her heartbeat, steady and strong, and I used it to ground myself. I wasn't a monster, not yet. And I wasn't going to let this curse take me. Tanner snarled, charging at me again, but this time I was ready. I sidestepped his attack, grabbing his arm and twisting it with all my strength. He roared in pain, stumbling back, and I pressed the advantage, slamming into him with everything I had. We hit the ground hard, and I pinned him there, my claws digging into his shoulders. "Enough," I growled, my voice echoing in the stillness of the forest. "I'm not one of you. I never will be." For a moment, Tanner didn't move. He just stared up at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. Then, slowly, he let out a low, growly sound of defeat. The rest of the pack shifted uneasily, their glowing eyes flicking between me and their fallen leader. They seemed unsure, like they didn't know what to do next. The silence was broken by a sharp, clear voice. "Paul, now!" It was Mom, standing at the edge of the clearing, holding something in her hands, a small stone pendant etched with strange symbols. I didn't know what it was, but I trusted her. I scrambled off Tanner, backing away as she stepped forward. "This ends here," she said, her voice steady and strong. "You're not taking my son, and you're not taking anyone else either." She threw the pendant to the ground, and the moment it hit the earth, a bright, blinding light erupted from it. The pack howled in pain, retreating into the shadows, their forms flickering like smoke. Even Tanner seemed afraid, his massive body trembling as the light washed over him. And then, just like that, they were gone. The clearing was silent again, the forest eerily still. I collapsed to my knees, the exhaustion hitting me all at once. My body still ached, the wounds on my arm throbbing. But I was alive. I was me. Mom and Dad rushed to my side, pulling me into a tight hug. "You did it," Mom whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You fought it." "I couldn't have done it without you," I said, my voice hoarse. "Without both of you." Dad glanced at the clearing, his face pale. "Is it over?" he asked. "Are they gone?" Mom nodded, though she didn't look entirely certain. "For now," she said, "but we need to leave, now." We packed up the RV in record time, not stopping to look back at the forest as we drove away. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft golden light over the trees. But to me, the shadows still felt too long, too dark. I didn't know if Tanner and his pack were really gone, or if they were just waiting for another full moon. But one thing was certain. I wasn't the same person I'd been when we arrived. I didn't know what the future held, or if the curse would ever fully let me go. But as I looked at my parents, their hands clasped tightly together, I knew one thing for sure. We'd faced the pack, and we'd survived. We didn't stop driving until the forest was far behind us. None of us spoke. The silence in the RV wasn't calm, it was heavy, weighed down by everything that had just happened. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional groan from the RV's beaten-up frame. I sat in the back, leaning against the window, staring out at the trees as they blurred into streaks of green and gray. For a moment, I thought I saw something movement between the trees, a flash of glowing eyes. I blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling stayed. They were still out there, somewhere. "Are you okay?" Mom asked softly, turning around from the passenger seat. Her face was pale, her eyes full of worry. I hesitated, not sure how to answer. Physically, I was fine, aside from the claw marks on my arm that Dad had hastily bandaged with a strip of cloth. But inside, I felt different. The fire that had burned in me the heat, the hunger, it was quieter now, but not gone. It was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. "I'm Fine, I said finally, though I wasn't sure if it was true. I think. Mom gave me a small, sad smile, like she knew I was lying but didn't want to push me. Dad, meanwhile, kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the steering wheel tight. His knuckles were white. Do you think they'll follow us? I asked after a while, my voice quiet. Mom and Dad exchanged a look. It was subtle, but I caught it. The kind of look parents give each other when they don't want their kid to know how scared they are. I don't think so, Dad said finally, his voice steady but tense. Not after what your mom did. They're afraid of the light, Mom added. That pendant those Symbalsit drove them back. They won't come near us. For now, I said, finishing her sentence. She didn't correct me. As the hours passed, the forest gave way to open fields, the tall grass swaying in the breeze like waves on the ocean. The sun climbed higher, painting the sky in soft shades of blue and gold. It should have been beautiful, peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all wrong. That no matter how far we drove, the pack would always be out there, waiting for the right moment. I don't understand, I said finally, breaking the silence. Why me? Why us? What do you mean? Mom asked, turning to look at me. Why did they come after me? I said. Tanner, the packet wasn't random. They wanted me. You said it was because of the curse, because of our family, but why now? Why here? Mom hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. The curse is tied to the land, she said slowly. To the forest. It's where it began. When we came here, when you set foot in those woods, it woke something up. Something old, Dad added, his voice grim. Something we don't fully understand. And maybe we never will. I frowned, the weight of their words settling heavily on my chest. So what now? I asked. Do I just live with this? With them? Mom reached out, taking my hand in hers. We'll figure it out, she said firmly. You're not alone in this, Paul. We'll help you. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't something they could help me with. It wasn't something anyone could fix. The fire inside me, the pull of the forest, it was part of me now, and I didn't know if it would ever go away. That night, we stopped at a small motel off the highway. It was late, the sky dark and cloudy, the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of gray. The place was quiet, the parking lot empty, except for a few scattered cars. Dad went inside to check us in, while Mom and I stayed in the RV, the silence stretching between us. Paul, she said finally, breaking the stillness. Do you remember what Catherine said about the moonwalkers? I nodded slowly. She said they walk between two worlds, that they're not fully human or fully wolf. Mom's eyes met mine, her expression serious. That's what you have to fight, she said. The pull to become one of them. To lose yourself. You're still you, Paul. No matter what happens, you're still our son. Her words were comforting, but they didn't erase the fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. What if I couldn't fight it? What if the hunger, the fire, became too strong? What if the next full moon came, and I wasn't able to stop myself? I didn't say any of that, though. Instead, I just nodded and said, I'll try. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in the motel bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioner. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and cleaning supplies, but beneath it, I could smell something else. Something faint but sharp, like pine needles and damp earth. The forest. It was still with me, even here. The fire in my chest flickered, and for a moment, I thought I heard it again, the howl. Faint and distant, carried on the wind. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked out the window. The moon had broken through the clouds, casting its pale light over the empty parking lot. The shadows seemed to shift and move, like they were alive. But there was nothing there. Just my reflection staring back at me, my eyes dark and tired. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but for a split second, I thought I saw something else in the glass. Something wild, something not quite human. I looked away, pulling the curtains shut. The full moon was over. For now, I was safe. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the end. The pack was still out there, waiting, and so was the fire inside me. All I could do was hope that when the time came, I'd be strong enough to fight it. To stay human, to stay me. My name is Marcus Blackwood, and this happened to me 8 years ago. To this day, I still can't tell the story without a shiver running down my spine. I don't know why I'm sharing this now. Maybe I'm hoping someone out there will believe me. Or maybe I just can't carry this weight any longer. You see, what we went through, my family and I, that summer in the Boulder Creek Valley, it changed us forever. It destroyed us. It all started when I decided to drag my family on a trip to northern Arizona. I thought it would be a peaceful getaway, a break from the chaos of the city. I had just turned 42, and I was tired of work, tired of the noise, tired of the memories of Vietnam that haunted me in my sleep. So, I packed up our old Winnebago, grabbed my camera, and convinced Rachel, my wife, and Kevin, our 15-year-old son, to come along. Rachel didn't mind it, gave her time to work on her botany research. She's an amateur botanist, always fascinated by the weird little plants most people never notice. But Kevin? Well, Kevin hated the idea. He was your typical teenage boy, more glued to his Walkman and video games than interested in family time. We argued about it for a full week before leaving, but he eventually gave in. Or, should I say, Rachel told him he didn't have a choice. I remember the day we arrived at the valley. The drive was long and quiet, the desert stretching endlessly around us. Kevin was sulking in the back, his headphones on, while Rachel stared out the window, jotting notes in her journal. Boulder Creek Valley itself was breathtaking at first. Sight-rugged cliffs, swaying grass, and a dry creek bed that cut through the land like a scar. It was isolated, untouched, and exactly what I had been looking for. But from the moment we set up camp, there was, I don't know, something off about the place. I can't really explain it. The air felt heavy, like a storm was coming. Only the sky was perfectly clear. There wasn't any sound, either no birds, no bugs, not even the wind. It should have been a hint for us to leave right then and there, but we didn't. We met him that afternoon, Thomas Whitefeather. Everyone called him Old Tom, and he lived alone in a small wooden shed about a mile away. He came out of nowhere, walking slowly toward our RV while we unpacked. At first, I thought he was just a curious neighbor, excited to see new faces in such a remote area. But when he got closer, I noticed the unease in his eyes. "You don't belong here," he said quietly, his voice low and gravelly. He pointed at the valley behind us, his hand trembling slightly. "This place, this valley, is not for you. It's not safe. You have to leave, now." I remember laughing nervously, trying to brush it off. "Thanks for the heads up," I told him, thinking he might just be some superstitious old-timer. "But we'll be fine. We're just camping for a few days, taking some photos, exploring. Nothing dangerous." Tom didn't laugh. He just stared at me, his lips pressing into a thin line. "They walk here," he said after a long silence. "The ones that wear the skin of others, the ones that become what you love, so they can take it away. Skinwalkers." Rachel's eyebrows shot up. "Skinwalkers? You mean the Navajo folklore?" "It's not just folklore," Tom said. His voice dropped even lower, like he was afraid someone or something might overhear. "Their spirits live in this land. The curses are older than you can understand." His dark eyes flicked toward Kevin, who had just stepped out of the RV. "And they love the young ones. They get inside their heads, their hearts. They'll tear your family apart." That was enough for Rachel. She grabbed my arm and whispered, "Marcus, maybe we shouldn't stay here. We can go somewhere else. There are plenty of other places to camp." But I shook my head. "Come on, Rach, it's just a story. There's nothing out here but rocks and coyotes. We'll be fine." Old Tom watched us for a moment longer, then sighed heavily. "If you won't leave, at least take this." He pulled a small leather pouch from around his neck and handed it to me. Inside was a tiny hand-carved amulet shaped like a crescent moon. It might keep them away for a time. I didn't really believe in charms or amulets, but something in Tom's voice made me take it. "Thanks," I said, slipping it into my pocket. "We'll be careful." Tom didn't answer. He just turned and walked away, fading into the horizon like a ghost. I didn't know it then, but that was the last time I'd ever see him alive. That night, everything was finny at first. We ate dinner by the campfire, and Kevin spent most of the time whining about being bored. Rachel tried to cheer him up by showing him the constellations, but he just rolled his eyes. Eventually, we all retreated into the RV, tired from the long day. Around midnight, I woke up. It wasn't Rachel or Kevin stirring in their bunks that woke me. It wasn't any sound inside the RV. It was outside. A scratching noise, faint and slow, moving along the side of the RV like claws dragging across metal. I sat up, confused and still groggy. "Probably just a raccoon," I muttered to myself. But something about the sound wasn't right. It wasn't random, like an animal sniffing around. It was deliberate. Skirk, skirk, asterisk. Like someone or something was circling us, inspecting us. I peeked out the window but couldn't see anything in the darkness, just the outline of the valley and the faint shimmer of stars overhead. The scratching stopped, and I sighed in relief, telling myself I'd imagined it. But then, just as I was lying back down, I heard it again. Not scratching this time. Laughter. Faint, high-pitched laughter, like children playing in the distance. Except who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, laughing at midnight? I wanted to get up, to open the door and see for myself. But something in my gut told me not to. Something told me to stay where I was, to pretend I hadn't heard anything at all. The laughter faded, and eventually, I fell asleep again. But even then, I felt the weight of something watching us, just out of sight. Something that didn't belong. That was the first night in Boulder Creek Valley, and it was just the beginning. The next morning, I tried to forget the strange noises I'd heard the night before. Maybe it had been a raccoon or some other animal. We were in the desert after all. It's not uncommon for wildlife to wander around at night. At least, that's what I kept telling myself as I fried some eggs on the RV's little gas stove. Rachel was outside, crouched down in the dirt, carefully examining some tiny flowers growing near the edge of the valley. She loved this stuff, cataloging plants, pressing their leaves into her notebook, making little notes about each one. It always calmed her. "Morning," Rachel said as she came back inside holding a bag of freshly picked samples. "You sleep okay?" I hesitated. "Yeah," I lied. "You?" She shrugged. "I guess. Felt like the air was thick, you know. Hard to breathe. Maybe I'm just not used to being up this high." I didn't want to worry her, so I just nodded and handed her a plate of eggs. Kevin, as expected, wasn't up yet. He was still sprawled across his bunk with his headphones on, some scratchy rock music leaking out at full blast. I knocked on the wall next to him. "Hey, rise and shine. Big day ahead." "Leave me alone," he groaned, pulling the blanket over his head. Rachel gave me a look. One of those just let him be looks she was so good at. "Let him sleep," she said softly, settling into the tiny table to eat. It's not like there's much for him to do anyway. But I wasn't about to let Kevin spend the whole trip sulking. "Come on," I said, yanking the blanket off him. "We're going exploring. You can't just sit in here all day. You're going to remember this trip one day, and you'll thank me." "Doubt it," Kevin muttered. But he finally sat up, rubbing his eyes. "This place sucks." We spent most of the morning hiking along the edge of the dry creek bed. Rachel stopped every few minutes to study a plant or jot something down, while I snapped photos of the cliffs and the strange shadows they cast in the morning light. Kevin trudged behind us, kicking rocks and muttering about how boring it all was. I tried to ignore him, but I could feel Rachel's patience wearing thin. "Maybe we should let him go back," she whispered to me at one point. He's not enjoying this. No, I said firmly. We're here as a family. He'll deal with it. We kept walking until we came across something that stopped us all in our tracks. It was a coyote, or what was left of one. Its body had been shredded, its fur matted with blood that had already turned dark and sticky in the heat. But that wasn't the worst part. The pieces of the coyote had been arranged. Its legs were bent at unnatural angles, its head tilted back as if screaming at the sky. Around it, the ground was covered in strange symbols drawn in red. At first I thought it was just blood, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't just blood, it was paint. Someone had mixed paint with the blood to create these shaped circles, jagged lines, and what looked like claw marks, all leading toward the center where the coyote lay. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath, lowering my camera. The lens had been pointed at the scene, but I couldn't bring myself to take the picture. Rachel gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. "Marcus, what is this? Who would do something like this?" Kevin stood frozen, his face pale. "We should go," he whispered. "We shouldn't be here." I agreed. There was something wrong about the whole thing, something that made my stomach twist. It felt deliberate, like whoever had done this had wanted it to be found. Like it was a message for anyone who dared to wander too far into the valley. "We're going back," I said, my voice firm. "Now." Rachel didn't argue, and Kevin didn't complain. We turned and headed back to the RV, my camera bouncing against my chest with every step. I didn't take any pictures the whole way. For some reason, it felt wrong. Like documenting what we'd seen might bring something worse upon us. That night, the air grew colder than it should have in the desert. Rachel was inside, working on her samples, when she suddenly let out a sharp cry. I rushed to her side and found her holding one of the bags of plants she'd collected that morning. The leaves, bright green when she'd plucked them, had turned black and shriveled, almost as if they'd been burned. "What happened?" I asked, staring at the wilted plants. "I don't know," she said, her voice shaky. "I just opened the bag and look." She pointed to the inside of the bag. Thin streaks of what looked like ash had gathered at the bottom, mixed with tiny black bugs that squirmed and writhed before crumbling into dust right before our eyes. "It's just a bad batch," I said, trying to sound calm. "Or maybe some kind of disease." Rachel didn't respond. She just kept staring at the plants, her face pale, as if she was thinking about something but didn't want to say it out loud. Kevin, meanwhile, was acting stranger than usual. He'd barely said a word since we'd found the coyote that morning, and he spent most of the evening sitting outside, staring at nothing. When I finally went out to check on him, he jumped like I'd caught him doing something he shouldn't have. "You okay, buddy?" I asked, sitting down next to him on the RV steps. Kevin didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the horizon, watching the cliffs turn dark as the sun dipped below them. "Do you think old Tom was right?" he asked quietly. "About skinwalkers?" I didn't know how to answer. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to tell him there was no such thing. But another part, the part that hadn't been able to shake the feeling of being watched since we arrived, wasn't so sure. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But whatever's out here, we'll handle it. We're fine, Kev. Don't worry." Kevin nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He stayed outside a little longer, even after it got too cold for comfort. I watched him from the window, wondering what was going through his mind. And for the first time, I wondered if this trip had been a mistake. When night fell, the strange sounds started again. This time, it wasn't scratching or laughter, it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the RV, crunching against the dry dirt. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while Rachel slept beside me. Every muscle in my body told me to get up, to look outside, but I was frozen, too afraid to move. At some point, the footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It pressed in around us, thick and smothering, as if the whole valley was holding its breath. And somewhere in the silence, just barely audible, I thought I heard someone whisper my name. "Marcus." It was so faint, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. But even as I lay there, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, I knew deep down that something was wrong. Something was coming. The next morning, I stepped outside the RV, telling myself the night before had just been my mind playing tricks on me. But the moment my feet hit the dirt, it felt like I'd stepped into a different world. The air was quiet again. So quiet it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. No birds, no insects, no movement. Just that same heavy stillness pressing down on everything like a weight. Rachel was already outside, sitting on the RV steps with her notebook open. She looked tired, her hair pulled into a messy braid, dark circles under her eyes. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked her, my voice low. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Footsteps," she said softly. "And something else, like whispering. Did you hear it too?" "Yeah." I swallowed hard, not wanting to admit how much it had shaken me. "It's probably just animals. They wander at night, you know." Rachel didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue either. Instead, she looked back down at her notebook, tracing the yellowed pages with her fingers. I don't feel right here, Marcus. Maybe old Tom was onto something. Maybe we should leave." I wanted to agree. I really did. But part of me still felt like leaving would mean giving into fear, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. "Let's give it one more day," I said. "If it still feels off, we'll go, okay?" Rachel nodded slowly. "All right, one more day." Kevin eventually woke up and dragged himself outside, his usual teenage grumpiness replaced with something quieter and heavier, almost like he was carrying some invisible weight. I tried to cheer him up, suggesting he grab his camera and join me for a short hike, but he just shrugged. "Whatever," he said. "I'll come." We walked along the edge of the cliffs as the morning sun slowly crept higher, painting the rocks in shades of orange and red. I focused on taking pictures, framing shots of the jagged landscape, while Kevin trailed behind, kicking the dirt and staring at the ground. I didn't want to push him, so I let the silence sit between us. After about an hour, Kevin stopped. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to the base of the cliff ahead of us. I turned and followed his gaze. There, etched into the rock face, were carvings ancient symbols that looked like they'd been chiseled into the stone long ago. Circles, spirals, and stick figures, all connected by jagged lines. At first, I thought it might be graffiti, but the deeper we looked, the clearer it became that these carvings were something older, much older. Rachel caught up with us, her breath hitching as she saw the carvings. These look like petroglyphs," she said, her voice tinged with excitement and unease. "Native American, I think. Maybe Navajo." "What do they mean?" Kevin asked, his voice quieter than usual. Rachel leaned in closer, squinting at the ancient symbols. "I'm not sure. Some of them look like warnings. Look at this one, it's a figure, but it's changing, almost like it's turning into something else. An animal, maybe." I didn't want to admit it, but the image gave me a sinking feeling in my gut. It looked like a person mid-transformation, half human, half creature, with long claws and twisted features. The jagged lines surrounding it could have been lightning or worse, something moving, reaching. Kevin took a step back, his face pale. "We shouldn't be here," he said again, his voice trembling. "We should leave. Mom, Dad, this place, it's bad." "All right," I said, gripping his shoulder gently. "Let's go back to the RV." When we returned, the RV was eerily quiet. Rachel busied herself with her plants again, though I noticed her hands shaking as she worked. Kevin disappeared into the back, pulling the curtain closed around his bunk. I let him be. He looked like he needed space. And honestly, so did I. I grabbed my camera and went through the photos I'd taken earlier, scrolling through one image after another. At first, everything looked normal: rocks, cliffs, shadows. But then I froze. In one of the photos, taken near the petroglyphs, there was something, a figure. I leaned in closer, squinting at the tiny screen. It was faint, almost like a shadow, but it had a shape-long arms, hunched shoulders, and a head that wasn't quite human. It stood in the corner of the frame, watching us. I felt my stomach drop. How had I not seen it when I took the picture? There'd been no one there. No one. Before I could think about it too much, Kevin appeared behind me. "What's that?" he asked, startling me. "Nothing," I said quickly, turning the camera off. "Just a bad shot." Kevin didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes, but he didn't push. Instead, he ran a hand through his messy hair and muttered, "I'm going for a walk. I need some air." "Kevin, don't go too far," Rachel called from the kitchenette, but he didn't answer. He just grabbed his jacket and slipped outside, the door creaking shut behind him. 3 hours later, Kevin still hadn't come back. Rachel was pacing inside the RV, her face pale and tight with worry. "This isn't like him," she said, glancing out the window for the 100th time. What if something happened to him? Marcus, we have to find him." "I will," I said, grabbing the flashlight and stepping outside. "You stay here in case he comes back. I'll look around." The valley was eerily quiet as I searched, the only sound coming from my boots crunching against the dry ground. I called Kevin's name again and again, the sound echoing off the cliffs. No answer. No movement. Just that same oppressive stillness, heavier than ever. I finally found him near the petroglyphs, sitting on the ground with his back to the cliff. "Kevin!" I shouted, rushing toward him. "What the hell are you doing out here? You've been gone for hours." He didn't look up. As I got closer, I realized he was staring at something in the dirt, a dead bird, its tiny body twisted and broken. His expression was blank, his eyes glassy, like he didn't even see me. "Kevin?" I crouched down, shaking his shoulder gently. "Hey, buddy, what's going on?" He blinked slowly, like he was waking up from a bad dream. I don't remember," he whispered. "I don't remember where I was. I was walking, and then I was here." "Come on," I said, pulling him to his feet. "We're going back." That night, Kevin didn't say a word. He didn't even eat. He just went straight to his bunk and closed the curtain, curling up under his blanket. Rachel tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't answer. When the sun went down, the sound started again. Not scratching this time. Not laughter. Words. Faint and broken, like someone whispering through a crack in the wall. They came from all around us, slipping through the tiny gaps in the RV's windows and doors. "Marcus!" This time, they didn't just say my name. They said Kevin's too, and Rachel's. And they were getting closer. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The whispers didn't stop. They circled the RV, floating through the stillness like they were carried on a breeze. But there was no breeze, just voices. "Marcus! Kevin! Rachel?" Each time, the whispers would come from a different direction. One moment they were by the front door. The next, they seemed to be right outside my window. It felt like whoever or whatever was out there was pacing around the RV, calling to us by name. Rachel sat up beside me, clutching the blanket tightly around her shoulders. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. "Yeah. What do we do?" For once, I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what to do. It wasn't like we could just walk out and confront whatever this was. And even if we wanted to leave, the RV's engine still wouldn't start. We were stuck. We stayed like that for hours, sitting in the dark, listening. At some point, the whispers stopped, and silence flooded back in. It wasn't a relief, though. The silence somehow felt worse, like the valley itself was watching us, waiting for us to crack. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside to check the RV's engine again. The air was colder than it had been the day before, crisp and sharp against my skin. As I moved around to the front of the RV, I froze. The entire side of the Winnebago was covered in scratch marks. Long, jagged lines ran from the roof to the ground, some crisscrossing, some straight and deep enough to cut into the paint. But what made my stomach turn was that they didn't look like animal scratches. They looked deliberate, like someone or something had clawed at the RV with purpose. "Marcus?" Rachel's voice came from the doorway. I turned to see her standing there, pale and wide-eyed. Her gaze followed mine to the scratches, and I saw her face crumble. What? What did that? I don't know, I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. But we're getting out of here. Today, I don't care if I have to fix the engine myself. We're leaving. Rachel nodded. But before she could say anything, Kevin stepped outside. He looked worse than he had the day before. His skin was pale, his eyes dark with exhaustion. He moved like he was carrying something too heavy for his small frame, his shoulders slumped and his feet dragging. Hey, bud, I said, forcing a smile. You doing okay? Kevin didn't answer. He just stared at the scratches, his face blank. Kevin? Rachel said, stepping toward him. Finally, he looked up at us. They're here, he said quietly. My heart skipped a beat. Who? What are you talking about? Kevin's hands curled into fists at his sides. The people from the drawings, the ones from the rocks. I saw them, last night, outside my window. I glanced at Rachel, and I could see the panic rising in her face. Kevin, you were probably dreaming, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. It's been a weird few days, and you're tired. I wasn't dreaming, Kevin snapped, his voice louder than I'd ever heard it. I saw them. They were looking at me. They had faces, but they weren't real faces, like masks. And they had long arms and sharp fingers. They kept tapping on the window. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth, and I felt my stomach churn. I wanted to tell Kevin he was imagining things, that it couldn't be real. But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. Later that morning, as I worked on the RV's engine, Rachel brought me a cup of water and sat down beside me. Marcus, she said softly, don't you think it's time we called for help? We don't have to stay here. Maybe there's a park ranger nearby, or... I shook my head. There's no signal out here. Even if there was, who would believe us, Rachel? That we're being haunted by shadows, by whispers? She didn't argue. She just sat there, watching me fumble with the engine wires. After a long silence, she said, Do you think old Tom was right about this place being cursed? I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to admit that. For the first time in my life, I was starting to believe in the impossible. That afternoon, we decided to take one last walk around the valley to clear our heads. It wasn't smart, I realize that now, but staying in the RV felt just as dangerous as leaving it. Rachel carried her notebook, jotting things down like she always did, while Kevin walked a few paces ahead, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. He hadn't said much since the morning, and Rachel and I were too tense to push him to talk. We ended up at a cave near the cliffs, half hidden behind a tangle of dry bushes. The entrance was wide and dark, the rock around it streaked with red stains that looked disturbingly fresh. Kevin stopped in front of it, staring at the opening like it was calling to him. Don't even think about it, I said, grabbing his shoulder. Kevin jerked away from me, his eyes burning with something I didn't recognize: anger, fear, maybe both. Why not? He snapped. Aren't you curious what's in there? Number, I'm not. My voice was firm, but inside, I was terrified. We're going back to the RV now. Kevin glared at me for a moment longer, then turned and started walking back without another word. Rachel and I followed, the tension between us heavy and suffocating. That night, everything fell apart. It started with Rachel. She'd been sitting at the table, writing in her notebook, when she suddenly gasped and dropped her pen. Marcus, she whispered, her voice trembling. Look. She held out her arm, and my heart stopped. A strange red rash had appeared on her skin, not a normal rash, though. The marks curled and twisted like symbols, running up her wrist and disappearing under her sleeve. Before I could say anything, Kevin stirred in his bunk, muttering in his sleep. At first it sounded like random words, but as I listened closer, I realized he was speaking a language I didn't recognize. His voice was low and guttural, completely unnatural coming from a 15-year-old boy. I rushed to his side, shaking him awake. Kevin, wake up! His eyes flew open, and for a moment, They didn't look like his eyes. They were darker somehow, the pupils too large, the whites barely visible. But then they blinked, and he looked normal again, confused. "Dad?" he said weakly. "What's wrong?" Before I could answer, we heard it. The laughter. It was louder now, closer, echoing through the valley like it was coming from everywhere at once. And mixed with it, faint but unmistakable, was the sound of scratching. It was coming from inside the RV. The scratching was faint at first, so faint I thought I might have imagined it. But then I heard it again, louder this time, like nails dragging along metal. My stomach dropped. Rachel and Kevin heard it too. Rachel grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and Kevin sat frozen on his bunk, hugging his knees to his chest. "It's nothing," I said quietly, trying and failing to sound calm. "Probably just the wind." But it wasn't the wind. It couldn't have been. The air outside was dead still, not a single branch swaying, and the noise wasn't coming from one spot. It was moving first on the roof, then along the walls, then under the RV. I could hear it circling us, like whatever was out there was searching, testing our defenses. "Dad," Kevin whispered. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the door, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What if it's inside?" I didn't answer. I didn't want to scare him or myself any more than we already were. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and flicked it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. "Stay here," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "Both of you. Don't open the door for anyone. Got it?" Rachel grabbed my hand before I could step outside. "Marcus, don't. Please, just stay here. We'll be safe if we stay inside." "I have to know what it is," I said, squeezing her hand. "I'll be fine. I promise." I wasn't sure if I believed my own words, but I stepped outside anyway, closing the RV door softly behind me. The air hit me like a wall, cold and heavy, thick with that strange silence that made my ears ache. I shined the flashlight around, sweeping it from the bushes to the cliffs, but I didn't see anything. No animals, no people, just shadows. But even though I couldn't see anything, I felt it. A weight, a presence, something standing just beyond the edge of the light, watching me. My heart raced, and my breathing grew shallow, but I forced myself to move. I checked around the RV, looking for anything the source of the scratching, footprints in the dirt, anything that could explain what we'd been hearing. Nothing. Just as I turned to head back, the flashlight flickered, then went out. I smacked it against my hand, cursing under my breath, but it didn't come back on, and that's when I heard it. The laughter. It was soft at first, like a child's giggle, but it quickly grew louder, echoing through the valley. High-pitched and sharp, it bounced off the cliffs and sent chills down my spine. It was coming from everywhere. I bolted for the RV, my heart hammering as the laughter grew louder and closer. I could feel it behind me, pressing in, crawling up my back. As I reached the door, I heard it my name. "Marcus." I froze, my hand on the door handle. The voice wasn't coming from the shadows. It was coming from inside the RV. When I finally stepped back into the RV, Rachel and Kevin were huddled together on the couch. They looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes. "Did you hear it?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, locking the door behind me. "It's nothing," I lied. "Just the wind messing with the cliffs. Echoes, that's all." Rachel narrowed her eyes, like she knew I wasn't being honest, but she didn't push. Kevin, on the other hand, wasn't convinced at all. "It's not the wind," he said firmly. "It knows our names, Dad. It's coming for us." "Kevin, stop," Rachel said, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "We're fine. We're safe in here." But Kevin shook his head. "No, we're not. It's already inside." My blood ran cold at his words, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Kevin, listen to me. Nothing is in here, okay? I've checked everything. The RV is locked up tight. We're safe." As soon as I said it, there was a loud thud from the back of the RV, like something had hit the wall, hard. All three of us jumped, and Rachel clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. "See?" Kevin whispered. "I told you." I grabbed the flashlight again, ignoring the way my hands were shaking, and slowly made my way to the back. The air inside the RV felt heavier than before, thick and suffocating, like I was wading through water. I reached Kevin's bunk and yanked the curtain aside. It was empty, but the wall next to it wasn't. 3 long, jagged scratch marks ran down the wall, carved deep into the plastic. I touched them lightly, my fingers trembling. They were clean cuts, fresh, as if made only moments ago. That's when I heard the tap, tap, tap. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. A light tapping sound coming from the roof. My breath caught in my throat as I stared up, my mind racing. It sounded like footsteps, slow and steady, pacing back and forth right above us. Rachel appeared behind me, her face pale. "Marcus, what is it?" I shook my head. "Go back to Kevin," I whispered. "Stay with him. Don't leave his side." "Marcus." "Go," I said firmly, and for once she didn't argue. That night was the longest night of my life. The footsteps on the roof didn't stop. Neither did the tapping. Every now and then, we'd hear a soft thud, like something heavy dropping onto the metal. Kevin didn't sleep, and neither did Rachel. They just stayed in the corner together, holding onto each other while I sat by the door, clutching a kitchen knife in one hand, and the amulet old Tom had given me in the other. At some point, I started talking to it. "Leave us alone," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You're not welcome here." The moment I said it, the voices returned. Marcus, Rachel, Kevin. They weren't whispers anymore. They were louder now, clearer, almost like the voices were right outside the door. And then, slowly, the voices began to change. They sounded like us. "Marcus," one voice said, and it was my own voice. "Rachel," another called, mimicking her gentle tone. "Kevin," the last one said, soft and trembling, like a scared little boy. Kevin started to cry, burying his face in Rachel's arm. "Make it stop," he whispered. "Please, Mom, make it stop." Rachel looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fight something I couldn't see, couldn't understand. All I knew was that it wasn't going to stop. Not until it got what it wanted. As the sun began to rise, the noises finally faded, leaving behind a silence that was somehow worse. The 3 of us sat there, too afraid to move, too drained to speak. I didn't know what was coming next, but I knew one thing for sure. We weren't safe anymore. The morning brought light, but it didn't bring safety. The valley didn't feel any less dangerous in the daylight, it just felt different. Instead of shadows hiding whatever was out there, the cliffs and dry ground seemed to hum with something invisible but heavy, like the land itself was alive, angry that we were still here. Rachel sat quietly at the small RV table, staring at her arm. The strange red marks, those curling, sharp, symbol-like shape shad, spread overnight. They ran up her wrist and now stretched halfway up her forearm. She tried to cover them with her sleeve, but I could see how much they scared her. "Does it hurt?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not really. It's just warm. Like it's burning, but not on the surface. It's deeper, Marcus. It's inside." I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know what it was. I'd always been the guy who could fix things, engines, broken fences, leaky sinks, whatever needed doing. But this wasn't something I could fix, and that terrified me. Kevin hadn't spoken much since the night before. He sat on the couch, knees pulled up to his chest, staring at the window without blinking. I walked over and sat beside him. "Hey," I said softly, nudging his shoulder. "You okay, bud?" He didn't look at me. "They're not going to stop," he said quietly. "You know that, right?" I swallowed hard. "We'll figure something out. We'll get out of here." "No, we won't." He finally turned to look at me, and the emptiness in his eyes nearly broke me. "You don't understand, Dad. They don't want us to leave. They're playing with us. They want us scared." "Kevin." They want her, he said, glancing at Rachel. And they want me. Hearing him say that made my chest tighten. That's not true, I said. Nothing's going to happen to you or your mom. I won't let it. Kevin just shook his head and looked back at the window. They've already started. Later that afternoon, I went outside to try the engine again. The air was still heavy, like the valley itself was pressing down on me, but I forced myself to focus. I had to get this thing running. I had to get us out. I opened the hood and stared at the mess of wires and metal, trying to figure out what was wrong. But as I leaned closer, I froze. The inside of the engine was wrecked. Cables had been torn, parts pulled apart and scattered. It didn't look like it had broken down on its own. It looked like someone or something destroyed it on purpose. Damn it, I muttered under my breath, slamming the hood shut. Marcus. Rachel's voice startled me, and I turned to see her standing just outside the RV. She looked pale, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Something's wrong with Kevin, she said. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? Just come inside, please. When I stepped into the RV, I found Kevin sitting cross-legged on the floor, his back to the door. He was hunched over something, muttering to himself in that strange, guttural language I'd heard before. My skin prickled, and I felt Rachel grab my arm tightly. Kevin, I said, taking a cautious step toward him. He didn't respond, didn't even look up. His hands were moving quickly, scratching something into the floor with a rock he must have picked up earlier. I crouched down slowly, reaching out to touch his shoulder. Kevin, what are you doing? This time, he stopped. His head tilted slightly, like he was listening to something only he could hear. Then, ever so slowly, he turned to face me. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. His eyes weren't right. They weren't Kevin's eyes. They were darker, deeper, like staring into a bottomless pit. And his face looked twisted, his features sharper, more animal-like. Kevin, I whispered, my voice barely audible. And then, just as quickly as it had changed, his face softened. His eyes returned to normal, and he blinked up at me like nothing had happened. Dad? He said, his voice small and shaky. What's going on? I pulled him into my arms, holding him tightly, but inside, I was falling apart. Whatever was happening to Kevin, it wasn't over. It was just beginning. That night, the valley came alive. It started with the laughter again soft and distant at first, but growing louder as the sun dipped below the cliffs. Rachel and I sat together on the couch, Kevin curled up beside her, his head resting on her lap. I had the kitchen knife in my hand again, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. The laughter grew closer, circling the RV, mixing with the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, heavy against the dirt. And then came the scratching, not on the roof this time. On the windows, tap, 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 asterisk. Rachel flinched with every noise, clutching Kevin tightly. I tightened my grip on the knife, my eyes darting to the windows. The curtains were pulled shut, but I could see the shadows moving on the other side. Figures, dozens of them. Marcus, one of them whispered, its voice sickly sweet, almost playful. Rachel, another called, softer, gentler, mimicking her own tone. Kevin. The last voice was deep, guttural, echoing unnaturally in the small space. Kevin whimpered, burying his face in Rachel's lap. Make it stop, he whispered. Please, make it stop. Dad, Rachel said, her voice trembling, what do we do? I didn't have an answer. I didn't even have a plan. All I could do was sit there, holding the knife, and listening to the sound of the valley closing in around us. And then the door handle rattled. It was subtle at first, like someone testing it, trying to see if it was locked. But then it grew more aggressive. The entire RV shook as something slammed against the door, over and over, like it was trying to break in. Dad! Kevin cried, his voice rising in panic. It's coming in! I jumped to my feet, positioning myself in front of the door. "Stay back!" I yelled, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. "Just stay back!" But then the banging stopped. The RV fell silent, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then came the voice from the other side of the door. "Marcus," it said softly. And this time, it wasn't a stranger's voice. It was Asterisk, Kevin's Asterisk. "Dad, let me in," the voice said, calm and familiar. "It's me. I'm outside. Let me in." I felt my chest tighten. My grip on the knife wavered. "No," I whispered. "You're not out there. You're here." "Dad, please," the voice said again, more desperate now. "It's cold. I'm scared. Let me in." "It's not him," Rachel whispered behind me. "Marcus, don't open the door, please." I didn't, but I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to. "Dad?" the voice said one last time before fading into the silence. And for the rest of the night, we stayed there, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe. Whatever was outside, it was waiting, and it wasn't going to stop. I didn't even realize I'd fallen asleep, but when I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was pale early morning light creeping through the edges of the RV's curtains. Rachel was curled up on the couch, Kevin's head still resting on her lap. Both of them looked exhausted, like they hadn't moved all night. Maybe they hadn't. I couldn't remember when I drifted off, but the knife I'd kept by my side was still lying on the floor, my hand resting near it. For a moment, I thought maybe we'd finally gotten a break. The valley was quiet again. No laughter, no whispers, no banging on the door, just silence. But it didn't feel comforting. It felt like the kind of silence that comes before something worse. I stood up, stretched my stiff legs, and moved to the window. The scratches from the night before were still there, deep and jagged, and as I looked around, I noticed something else: footprints. Dozens of them scattered in the dirt around the RV. They weren't normal footprints, though. They were too big, with long, claw-like toes that trailed behind them, as if something had been dragging its feet. My stomach twisted, but I didn't say anything. Rachel and Kevin didn't need to know. Not yet. Rachel woke up an hour later, rubbing her eyes and wincing as she stretched her arm. The strange markings had spread even further overnight. They now ran all the way up to her shoulder, hidden mostly by her sleeve, but I caught a glimpse when she adjusted her shirt. The symbols looked more detailed now, like lines and shapes were starting to connect into patterns. It was like they were alive, growing. "How's your arm?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She gave me a weak smile. "It's fine. Let's just focus on getting out of here." I didn't have the heart to tell her the engine was beyond repair. I didn't even know how to start that conversation. Instead, I grabbed my camera, slinging it over my shoulder. "I'm going to look around, see if I can find, I don't know, something, a way out." Rachel's eyes widened. "Marcus, no, don't leave us. Not now." "It's broad daylight," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll be fine. Just stay here with Kevin. Lock the door and don't open it for anyone." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. "Be careful," she said softly. Walking around the valley in daylight wasn't as comforting as I'd hoped. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far, every small rock shifting. The whistle of the wind felt like it could be something else. Something watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of those long, twisted figures Kevin had described. But the valley was empty. I ended up back at the cave near the cliffs, the one we'd found 2 days earlier. The red stains around the entrance looked darker now, almost fresh, and the air near the opening was colder than it should have been. My skin prickled as I stood there, staring into the darkness. I didn't want to go inside, but something about the cave pulled at me, like it wanted me to step closer. I knelt down, snapping a quick photo of the entrance and the strange stains. As I stood back up, my camera slipped from my hands and hit the ground. I cursed under my breath, leaning down to grab it. But as I picked it up, I froze. There was something behind me. I could feel it hear it. Slow, heavy breathing, faint but unmistakable. My entire body locked up, my chest tightening as the breathing grew louder, closer. I turned slowly, my hands shaking, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was Kevin. Or at least, it looked like Kevin. He was standing a few feet away, his head tilted slightly, his face blank. But there was something wrong. His eyes were too dark, almost black, and his stance wasn't natural. His body looked stiff, like it didn't know how to move properly. "Dad," he said, his voice soft and strange. "What are you doing out here?" I blinked, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. "Kevin," I whispered, How did you get here?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me with those two dark eyes, his head twitching slightly to one side. "Come back to the RV," he said. "Mom's waiting for you." My heart pounded as I took a small step back. Something about the way he said it flat, emotionless, sent chills down my spine. "Kevin," I said carefully, "if you're here, then who's in the RV?" For a split second, his face twitched. His mouth curled into something that wasn't a smile, more like a sharp, jagged sneer. And then, just as quickly as he'd appeared, he took a step back and disappeared into the shadows of the cliffs. I ran back to the RV as fast as I could, my lungs burning with every step. When I reached the door, I banged on it, yelling for Rachel to let me in. The door swung open, and she pulled me inside, her face pale and panicked. "Where's Kevin?" I asked, looking around. She pointed to the couch where Kevin was sitting, hunched over with his head in his hands. "He hasn't moved since you left," she said. I felt my chest tighten. "Are you sure? He didn't leave? Not even for a second?" "No," Rachel said, confused. "What's going on?" Before I could answer, Kevin lifted his head, looking straight at me. "Dad," he said softly, "I don't feel so good." I stepped closer, kneeling in front of him. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were bloodshot. I reached out to touch his forehead, but he flinched away. "It's inside me," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I can feel it, crawling, changing me." My stomach twisted as Rachel knelt beside me, grabbing Kevin's hand. "No," she said firmly. "We're going to help you. We'll figure this out." Kevin shook his head. "It's too late." That night, everything came to a head. The voices came back, louder than ever, shouting now instead of whispering. The laughter turned to screams, and the RV shook with every bang and scratch that hit the walls. Kevin curled up on the floor, clutching his stomach as Rachel held him, tears streaming down her face. "They're coming," he whispered over and over. "They're coming." And then, just before midnight, the banging stopped. The silence that followed wasn't calming. It was suffocating, pressing down on us like a weight. I stood by the door, the knife in one hand and old Tom's amulet in the other, waiting for whatever was coming next. And then I heard it. "Marcus," a voice called, calm and clear. "Rachel," it said again. And then, in a voice that sounded exactly like Kevin's, "Let us in." The voices outside were louder than ever now, banging on the sides of the RV, circling, calling out our names. Kevin lay curled up on the floor, his body trembling, his skin pale and cold. Rachel was next to him, stroking his hair, trying to calm him. But I could see it in her face. She was terrified. Terrified for him. Terrified for all of us. "It's almost midnight," she whispered. "What do you think they want?" I didn't answer. Deep down, I already knew. Kevin had said it earlier. They want him, and they want her. Asterisk. Every instinct in my body told me to protect them. But how do you fight something you can't even see? The strange, heavy silence fell again, tighter this time, pressing into my ears. Then I saw it through the window, the blood moon. It hung low in the sky, glowing a deep, eerie red. My stomach twisted as I stared at it, a cold realization washing over me. Whatever was happening, it wasn't random. This night had been planned. "They're here," Kevin whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're inside." The moment he said it, the inside of the RV grew colder. like someone had flung open a door to let the winter in. I could feel it wrapping around me sharp, biting, unnatural. Rachel gasped, clutching Kevin tighter, but I could see her breath fogging the air. The temperature had dropped fast, impossibly fast, and then the scratching started again. Only this time, it wasn't outside. It was coming from inside. The floor, the walls, even the ceiling above Use-It was everywhere at once, loud and frantic, like something or many somethings were trying to claw their way out. My grip on the knife tightened, and I stared at the amulet in my other hand, wishing it would somehow spark to life, show me what to do. But it didn't. It just lay there, cold and useless. Did you hear that? Rachel's voice brought me back, and I turned to her. She was staring at the back of the RV, where Kevin's bunk was. The curtain was drawn, but something was moving behind it. Something big. It moved slowly, the curtain bulging and shifting like someone or something was crouched there, waiting. A low, guttural growl rumbled from behind the thin fabric, and the hair on my arm stood up. "Marcus," Rachel whispered, "we have to leave. We can't stay in here." I didn't want to argue. I didn't want to stay either, but leaving meant going outside, and I wasn't sure that was any safer. "Stay with Kevin," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll check it out." She grabbed my arm. "Number." "I have to," I said. "If we're going to get out of this, I have to." She didn't let go at first, but then Kevin stirred beneath her, groaning softly. "Mom," he whispered, his voice weak. "Don't let them take me." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, and she finally released my arm. "Be careful." I nodded, taking a step toward the bunk. My heart felt like it might pound right out of my chest as I reached out for the curtain. My fingers brushed the fabric, and for a split second, everything went completely silent. The scratching stopped. The growling stopped. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath. And then I yanked the curtain open. Nothing. The bunk was empty. No scratches, no shadows, no signs of anything. But as I stood there, staring into the empty space, I felt something brush past me. It wasn't solid, more like a gust of freezing wind, but it carried a weight that made me stumble back. The air around me felt heavier, darker, and the growling started again, this time directly behind me. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting into knots. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was Rachel. But it wasn't her. Not really. She was standing in the middle of the RV, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes too wide, too dark. Her body moved stiffly, jerking like a puppet on strings. Kevin stared up at her from the floor, his face pale and frozen in terror. "Mom?" he whispered. The thing wearing Rachel's face smiled too wide, too sharpened, took a step toward him. "Stop!" I shouted, holding the knife out in front of me. "Stay away from him!" The thing turned to look at me, its head twitching violently, the smile never fading. "Marcus," it said, and the voice was hers, but it wasn't. It was wrong. "Why are you afraid? It's only me." "You're not her," I said, gripping the knife tighter. My hands were shaking, but I didn't care. "Stay back." "You love her." The thing took another step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. "You love him. That's why we're here. To take what you love most." "Get out!" I shouted. "Leave us alone!" Behind the thing, Kevin groaned again, clutching his stomach as his body twisted against the floor. "Dad," he whispered, "help me." I didn't know what to do. If I went for Rachel, I'd leave Kevin undefended. But if I stayed by Kevin, I couldn't stop whatever was happening to Rachel. My mind raced, trying to figure out a way to save them both. And then the thing laughed. "Your family is ours now," it said. And in that moment, I knew I had to choose. The red moonlight poured into the RV, casting everything in an eerie glow. Time slowed as the thing lunged at Kevin, its sharp smile breaking into something jagged and monstrous. I moved without thinking, throwing myself between them. But the impact sent both Kevin and me sprawling to the floor. "Marcus!" Rachel's voice, her real voice, broke through the chaos, and I turned to see her struggling, clawing at her own skin. Her body jerked violently, like she was fighting against something unseen, and for a brief moment, her darkened eyes flickered back to normal. "Take Kevin," she gasped. "Get him out of here, now." "No," I shouted. "I'm not leaving you." "You have to," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's the only way." The thing inside her twisted her mouth into that horrible smile again, but Rachel fought it, holding it at bay. "Go!" she screamed. I didn't want to, but there wasn't time to argue. Scooping Kevin into my arms, I bolted for the door, throwing it open and racing into the freezing night air. The sounds of laughter, growling, and Rachel's screams chased me into the darkness. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the valley, the red moon looming overhead like an eye watching everything. Kevin clung to me, his body shaking violently, his skin cold as ice. "Dad," he whispered, barely able to speak, "it's not over." I knew he was right. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. And Rachel was still back there. I turned to look back at the valley, now shrouded in shadow, Rachel's scream echoing faintly in the distance. My hands tightened around old Tom's amulet, and for the first time in my life I started to pray. I don't remember how long I stood there, holding Kevin in my arms, staring back at the valley. My mind felt blank, like I had been drained of every thought, every ounce of energy. Rachel's screams were no longer echoing in the air, and that terrified me more than the noise itself. The silence that came after was crushing, heavy, final. Kevin stirred in my arms, his voice weak. "Dad, she's gone." I shook my head firmly, though my throat burned with the weight of everything pressing down on me. "No, she's not," I said. "I'm going back for her." Kevin's body trembled as he clung to me, his face buried against my chest. "Don't. They'll take you too." I looked down at him, at his pale face and trembling hands. My boy, my only son. I had promised myself I'd protect him, I'd keep him safe, but now Rachel, me wife, his mother, was back there, and I couldn't abandon her. I couldn't leave her to whatever those things were. "You stay here," I said softly, setting Kevin down on the cold ground. "Don't move. Don't follow me. Just stay here, no matter what happens." Kevin grabbed my hand, his grip weak but desperate. "You won't make it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You don't know what they are. You can't fight them." I held up old Tom's amulet, the small crescent-shaped charm that I had kept clutched in my fist all night. "Maybe this will help," I said, though I didn't believe it. Not really, but it was all I had. Kevin's dark eyes locked onto mine. "It won't stop them," he said, "but it might slow them down." That was all the encouragement I needed. I pressed the amulet against my chest, whispered a silent prayer to no one in particular, and turned back toward the valley. Every step I took felt heavier than the last as I moved deeper into the dark, red-lit wasteland. The cliffs loomed like jagged teeth, and the shadows seemed alive, shifting and stretching as the blood moon cast its eerie glow over the land. And then I heard it. A voice. "Marcus." It wasn't Rachel's voice. It was my own. The voice called to me from the darkness, calm and familiar. "Why are you fighting us?" it said, soft and coaxing. "We can give you what you want. We can make it so you never suffer again." I ignored it and kept walking, gripping the amulet so tightly that its edges left marks on my palm. Another voice joined at Rachel's this time. "Marcus," it said, "I need you. Come to me. Help me." I froze in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. It sounded like her, exactly like her. But I knew it couldn't be. Not really. "Where are you?" I shouted into the dark. "Here," the voice answered, and as I turned I saw a figure stepping toward me from the shadows. It was Rachel, or at least, it looked like her. She was wearing the same clothes, the same tired but lovely face I'd known for years. But her smile, it was wrong, too wide, too sharp. "Marcus," she said, holding out her hand. "It's me. I'm okay now. We can go home. I clenched the amulet tighter, taking a step back. You're not her. Her face twitched, the smile growing even wider. Of course I am. Don't you love me? She took a step closer. Don't you want to save me? Where is she? I shouted again. Where's my wife? The thing tilted its head, its neck cracking at an unnatural angle. The smile vanished, replaced by something empty and cold. She's gone, it said flatly. And soon you will be too. It lunged at me, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. I stumbled back, raising the amulet in front of me like a shield, and the thing stopped in its tracks. Its face twisted in pain, and it let out a horrible, guttural scream that echoed through the valley. The amulet worked. At least, it worked enough to drive it back, but I knew it wouldn't hold for long. I kept running, deeper into the valley, searching for any sign of Rachel. The shadows around me moved like they were alive, stretching and writhing, and the voices followed me wherever I went. Some whispered my name, others screamed it, but I blocked them out. I had to keep going. Finally, I saw her. She was lying near the mouth of the cave, her body still, her arms sprawled out on the ground. My heart stopped as I ran to her, dropping to my knees beside her. "Rachel!" I shouted, shaking her gently. "Rachel, wake up!" Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, they were her eye soft, warm, familiar. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice weak. "You shouldn't have come." Tears welled up in my eyes as I pulled her into my arms. "I'm getting you out of here," I said. "Both of you. Kevin's waiting for us." But then her body went rigid, and I felt something cold wrap around my wrist. Her hand. "Marcus," she said again, her voice darker now, distorted. "You can't save us." I pulled away, stumbling back, and her face began to change. The soft, familiar features twisted and stretched, her eyes darkening, her mouth curling into that horrible, jagged smile. "She's not here anymore," the thing said, rising to its feet. "But you can join her. Stay with us." I raised the amulet again, but this time, the thing didn't flinch. It just laughed, the sound low and chilling. "That won't work forever," it said. "You can't win." But then I remembered something. Something old Tom had said. They feed on family, on love, on pain. Asterisk, that's what they wanted. Not my body, not even my soul. They wanted what tied me to Rachel and Kevin. They wanted to break us apart. I reached into my pocket and pulled out something I hadn't touched since we arrived. Rachel's notebook. I opened it with shaking hands, flipping through its pages. They were filled with sketches, notes, little pieces of her mind and heart. And there, on the last page, I saw it. The protection symbol old Tom had drawn for her the day we arrived. I didn't know if it would work, but I pressed the notebook to my chest and shouted into the darkness, "You can't have her! You can't have us!" The thing that looked like Rachel shrieked, its form flickering like static on a broken television. The shadows around me writhed violently, and the ground began to shake. I held the notebook higher, screaming again, "You're not stronger than us. You'll never take us." The valley roared in anger, the blood moon glowing brighter and brighter until it filled the sky. And then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. The shadows were gone, the voices, the cold. I turned to Rachel, lying motionless on the ground, and this time, when her eyes opened, they were hers again. We stumbled out of the valley together, Kevin running to meet us where I had left him. He clung to Rachel like he'd never let go, and I wrapped them both in my arms, tears streaming down my face. The valley behind us grew darker and quieter as the blood moon faded, leaving nothing but silence in its place. We didn't look back. And even now, years later, I still don't. Because I know that if I do, I'll see it the thing wearing her face, smiling that jagged smile, waiting for me to fall apart,